The colonial experience covers the time between European colonization, setting up each European country's own sphere of influence, and the end of the American Revolution. Some examples of self government from the beginning is the House of Burgesses in Jamestown in 1619. This is about 10 years after the very first settlement of Jamestown, and it is the first representative assembly in America. Then you have the Mayflower Compact in Plymouth in 1620. They actually signed this before ever getting off of the boat to live at Plymouth. This establishes the very first town hall meetings. By about 1760, it's believed that both of these assemblies, whether it be a representative assembly or a more direct democracy style town hall meeting in New England, it's that these assemblies control the vital power of the purse, which means they control the ability to control funding bills. Now, in 1733, there was a very famous court case, and it's simply called the Zenger case. John Peter Zenger is a printer, which is an old word for a journalist, really. And he writes an article criticizing the governor of New York. He is arrested and charged with libel, which just means to speak or write wrongfully negative opinions of someone. Today's modern equivalent of that would be called defamation of character. His only defense, really, is that he was innocent because the information he was writing was true. And because it was true, he's acquitted. This really sets the stage for free speech later when the Bill of Rights is formed and the First Amendment establishes the right to free speech. In 1754, around the onset of the French and Indian War, the British wanted their colonies, instead of being scattered and representing only themselves, they wanted them to unite to fight off the French threat in North America. The way they did this was through the Albany Plan of Union. This is actually written by Benjamin Franklin. Representatives of the Crown meet up with a colonial assembly of sorts and come up with a plan of common defense of the colonies. So they want the colonies to band together to fight off the French. This fails to gain a majority vote from all parties involved, and the main reason being they did not want to give up their personal colonies' powers. That's very important. That develops into, later in our course, states' rights from the federal government. Now, this idea came from the Haudenosaunee political confederation of the Iroquois, in which 6 nations actually have a cooperative relationship with each other. So that's where the whole idea of the Albany Plan of Union comes from. Now, we already kind of mentioned the economic development of the colonies. The New England colonies were more focused on trading and shipbuilding. Maybe whaling and fishing could be added to that. The middle colonies were very focused around foodstuffs. Wheat, corn would be good examples. And then the southern colonies were focused on cash crop farming, such as tobacco and cotton. We've already discussed the geographic reasons for those careers developing in each of these regions. Salutary neglect. I am going to circle this because it is an extremely important term to know, not only for my test but for the Regents exam at the end of the year. No taxes or laws were really passed against the colonies in the early years of British colonization. So there's really not a reason to be mad at the British. Everybody's making money off of mercantilism and joint stock companies. Examples would be, in New England, money's being made selling goods and ships to Britain. In the middle colonies, surplus foods are being sold to Britain. And in the southern colonies, tobacco and cotton made huge money for the colonies being sold to Britain. At the end of the French and Indian War, however, the British really want the colonists to pony up and help pay for the war, because from the British government's perspective, the war was only fought for the protection of the colonies. Therefore, the colonists should be willing to help pay for it. This makes the colonists really, really angry. Land gained in the French and Indian War was also closed off to colonial settlement via the Proclamation Line of 1763. This made the colonists really angry too. You can see on this map where the pink area is showing where the British did not want the colonists to settle. They wanted them to concentrate themselves in this darker, bolder, like salmon-colored pink area. And the reason for that is they're trying to avoid conflicts with the Native American tribes along this proclamation line, hence the term Indian Reserve right here. And so the proclamation line and new taxes really, really made the colonists quite angry. The absolute causes of the American Revolution: taxes. The British viewed them as necessary to pay for the war. The colonists see them as unfair because they have no representation in Parliament. This is where the term "no taxation without representation" comes from. Very famous phrase. Some examples are the Stamp Act, which was a tax on paper products and postage. Some import taxes on teas, glass, etc. That is known as the Intolerable Acts when they get lumped together. Now, the colonial response is things like boycotts of British goods, such as homespun clothing rather than buying finished cloth from Britain. And then acts of protest, such as the Boston Tea Party. Now, the British retaliate to these things, such as in 1770, the same year as the Boston Tea Party, there is a massacre. Now, it's really not like an outright shooting unarmed people intentionally massacre like the Patriots would have wanted you to think. There was a group of protesters throwing rocks and snowballs and such at a group of British soldiers. All of a sudden, someone yelled, "Fire!" The soldiers thought it was their commanding officer giving the order to fire, so they fired into the unarmed crowd. So not exactly a massacre. There was a little more to it than that. However, there was a very, very famous engraving done by Paul Revere, and it made it look as though that's exactly what happened. The British simply fired into an unarmed crowd. And the soldiers got put on trial, and they were actually defended by John Adams, who ended up being a big supporter of the Patriot cause and the American Revolution, but he also believed in a fair trial. And he actually got all of the soldiers from the Boston Massacre acquitted from being charged with any crimes, because it was really just an accidental incident, according to his argument. Also, the Coercive Acts in 1774. This closes Boston Harbor to trade, and it's really as punishment for the Boston Tea Party, among other things that the Patriots had done in Boston. So these are all just moving in the direction of armed conflict. The First Continental Congress is called together in 1774 to negotiate with the British about the Coercive Acts. So the First Continental Congress was really trying to still negotiate peace. This is a good idea in theory, but 1 year later, in 1775, is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The British hear about the colonials having a weapons stash in the town of Concord. So it's ordered that British troops march to Concord, seize the weapons, and bring them back to Boston. Somehow, Paul Revere and some friends find out about this march to Concord. So the colonists are actually warned on Paul Revere's ride, where he famously says, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Actually, that's completely false. He said, "The regulars are coming. The regulars are coming." Or the redcoats are coming. the redcoats are coming. It would have been something more like that, because in this time, everybody thinks they're British. Even the colonists consider themselves British citizens, members of the British Empire. So he wouldn't have referred to the British, because he himself was probably considered British. Now, the British are a far superior fighting force, and in Lexington, they win handily and leave casualties behind. In Concord, they are forced to withdraw, but not because they couldn't have won, because they wanted to avoid a full-scale conflict that would inflame the rage of the Patriots even more than they already had. After withdrawing, the British troops are actually followed all the way back to Boston along the road, being shot at from the forested areas on either side of the road. This is the very first use of guerrilla tactics by the Patriots to support their revolutionary cause. Now, throughout the summer of 1775 and into the fall, a man by the name of Thomas Paine writes a book called Common Sense. Paine's book was published in January of 1776, and it is pushing for the colonists to declare independence from Great Britain. Also happening in early 1776, the Second Continental Congress is not immediately voting on the Declaration of Independence. They send one last message to the king. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. And the Olive Branch Petition says, please, let's negotiate, let's find a peaceful solution. We know we can reach some kind of an agreement. The king rejects, and when the rejection reaches back to the colonists, because remember, traveling across the ocean at this time is very difficult and takes a long, long time. So news reaches back to the colonies of the king's rejection of the Olive Branch Petition. And the Declaration of Independence is written by Thomas Jefferson. He edits it with his friends Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and it is finalized and signed on July 4th, 1776. It says, among many things, the main points are that governments are representative of the people and limited in power based on the natural human rights of man. Remember, this sounds a lot like John Locke. John Locke is really kind of like the man crush of Thomas Jefferson because of all of the ideas that Jefferson absolutely agrees with. It goes on to list grievances against the British Crown, such as dissolving colonial assemblies is wrong, keeping British troops in the colonies is wrong, and imposing taxes without the colonists' consent is wrong. So the Declaration of Independence makes it official that the revolution has now begun. Washington is absolutely routed early in the war. After seizing Boston following Lexington and Concord, and taking Boston from the British when they retreat, Washington loses New York City. The very British troops who left Boston marched and sailed on New York, and Washington's troops barely escape into New Jersey across the Hudson River. Within a year, Boston and Philadelphia fall. So 3 of the largest cities are now in British hands. There are turning points, however. Despite the defeat, despite cutting and running almost every time they fight, Washington comes up with a bold plan to attack Trenton. And on Christmas morning, 1776, Washington strikes his first big victory. He crosses the Delaware River, marches on Trenton, and attacks the Hessian mercenary troops that are stationed there. Caught by surprise, they couldn't use their superior military forces against Washington's ragtag army. Not quite a year later, the Battle of Saratoga in New York convinces the French to aid the colonial forces. Most historians would tell you that Saratoga is the only turning point of the war. However, I list both of these battles as turning points, because frankly, without a victory at Trenton, Washington's army probably would have crumbled and fallen apart. Finally, you have independence. After a few more years of skirmish-type fighting with few large battles, the Patriots surround British General Lord Cornwallis and his troops at Yorktown, Virginia, and they lay siege to the city. After a long siege, Cornwallis finally surrenders. That is the last major battle of the war. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris is finalized, and an official peace is made between the British and the Colonials, establishing the United States of America. The early government that ran the United States throughout the Revolution and into the early Republic was known as the Articles of Confederation. It is a very simple government, too simple in fact. It has the Continental Congress, a unicameral legislature, meaning one house. One, cameral, sounds kind of like camel, and that's the tricky little way I always remembered or bicameral. I know it's goofy, but picture a one-humped camel, and that's a unicameral legislature. If you picture a two-humped camel, that's a bicameral legislature. Today we have a bicameral legislature. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress had all of the power in the government, which is a unicameral legislature. There was no executive or judicial branch. This is a very, very inefficient and ineffective government. There were a couple successes of the Articles. It ended the war and negotiated peace with the British, and the Northwest Ordinance organized how the territory gained after the war would be settled, and how it could become a new state or a series of states. Really, it established population requirements, population thresholds. When you reached a certain threshold, you could apply for statehood. Some failures of the Articles, however. There's no power to tax, and when you have no power to tax, you can't pay for anything, including your own army. So people who had fought in the Revolution were not being paid, and for that matter, continuing to defend yourself would become hard without an army. There's also no power to regulate commerce, which is trade. This means trading among states, including currencies, was different in every state. If it still existed this way today, when you cross state lines, you would have to exchange your currency like you do today when you visit a foreign country. There was also a 2/3 majority vote required to pass any laws. That is very, very stringent and difficult to get anything done. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 was a group of debtor farmers demanding that they not be thrown off of their farms or out of their homes. Some of these men had yet to be paid for some of their service in the American Revolution. They marched on state and federal government offices, demanding some of the money that they had earned through their service in the Revolution, and they wanted it to pay for their farms. This causes people to question whether or not the country can even survive, because Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays and his group, is a really ragtag group of people, and they nearly overthrew the state of Massachusetts government. So this really scared people, and the result is the calling of a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, which will be the next thing we talk about in class.